The day started like any other flight for the passengers boarding the plane. The hustle and bustle at the airport was familiar. People rushing to catch their flights, others sitting in lounges sipping coffee or reading newspapers. There was a mix of emotions in the air. Some were excited, others nervous, while many were just hoping to get through the flight as comfortably as possible. Among the passengers on this particular flight were two individuals who couldn't have been more different from each other. A wealthy couple and a young boy traveling with his mother. The flight was a long one, taking passengers from one part of the country to a sunny vacation destination. The couple, well-dressed and carrying expensive bags, walked confidently to their seats in first class, where they settled in, looking both content and at ease. Their baby, who couldn't have been more than a year old, was strapped into a car seat by the window. The couple exchanged quiet words, seemingly excited for the holiday ahead. Then there was the young boy. He was not sitting in first class, but in coach along with his mother, a woman who had a humble appearance. The boy was around 9 or 10 years old with curly hair that looked like it had seen its fair share of adventure. He wasn't nervous about the flight. He had flown before, though always in the back of the plane, where the seats were smaller and the air felt a little thinner. His mother smiled at him as she adjusted his seatbelt, the kind of smile that only a mother could give, tender and protective. As the plane took off, everything seemed calm. The engines roared as the plane soared higher into the sky, the city below shrinking with every passing second. The boy gazed out the window, his eyes wide with excitement as he watched the clouds. His mother, sitting beside him, pulled out a small book from her bag, hoping to catch up on a few chapters. She hadn't had time to read much lately, and this was her moment of peace. But as the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign was turned off, something unexpected happened. From the front of the plane came the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. At first it was quiet, a soft whimper that barely caught anyone's attention. But then, as the minutes ticked by, the crying grew louder and more persistent. It wasn't just the sound of a baby being fussy. It was a cry that seemed to come from deep inside the child. A cry that echoed in the cabin and made everyone around it uncomfortable. The boy and coach winced a little at the sound. It wasn't the first time he'd heard a crying baby on a plane, but something about this one seemed different. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where he saw the wealthy couple doing their best to calm their child. The father gently rocked the baby in his arms while the mother whispered soft words, trying to soothe the infant. But nothing worked. The crying continued, growing louder by the minute. Passengers began to stir in their seats, their expressions shifting from patience to frustration. The flight attendants moved around offering drinks, snacks, and blankets, but no one could escape the incessant crying. Even those sitting near the front in first class seemed increasingly uncomfortable. For the boy and coach, the sound of the baby crying wasn't something that bothered him in the usual way. Sure, it was loud, and yes, it was a bit annoying, but there was something else about it, something that made him feel a little bit of sympathy for the parents. He could tell they were doing everything they could. The father looked tired, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested he hadn't gotten much sleep in the past few days. The mother, too, seemed exhausted, her face lined with worry. It was clear they loved their child, and they were trying their best to calm her. But nothing seemed to work. The boy thought about his own experiences. He knew what it felt like to be frustrated when things didn't go as planned. His mother always told him to stay calm, even when things were hard. "You can get through anything if you stay calm," she'd say. The boy believed that, but even he wasn't sure what could calm the baby on this flight. He watched as the mother of the baby bounced her in her lap, gently patting her back in the hopes that the movement might soothe her. The baby's face was red with exertion, her cries cutting through the cabin like a knife. The boy couldn't help but feel bad for the parents. No one likes to see their child upset, and here they were, trapped on a plane with no way to escape. Everyone was on edge now. A few rows behind the boy, an elderly woman in a seat near the window grumbled under her breath, looking impatient. She glanced around the cabin, hoping for some sign of relief, but it was clear that no one had an answer. The flight attendants, too, were visibly concerned. They tried to reassure the parents with kind words, but the problem was bigger than anyone had expected. The boy's mother, noticing his attention focused on the situation up front, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "Sometimes babies cry. It's just what they do." But the boy could see the discomfort in her eyes, too. It was hard for anyone to ignore the constant crying, and he knew it must be even harder for the parents. Time seemed to drag on. With every passing minute, the baby's cries echoed louder, and it felt like everyone on the plane could do nothing but wait for it to stop. The boy didn't understand why the baby couldn't be calmed, and a part of him wondered what could be done. He was used to seeing people in distress, but there was something different about this situation. He couldn't help but think that if he were in the parents' shoes, he'd feel helpless too. The plane cruised steadily through the air, but inside there was a sense of growing unease. As more time passed, the sounds of frustration grew louder. The boy's mother, trying to stay positive, kept reading her book. But the boy knew she was distracted. The constant crying had an effect on everyone. Passengers were shifting in their seats, trying to get comfortable. Some of them were even sighing heavily, their patience running thin. At the front of the plane, the baby's cries didn't seem to be letting up. The parents, exhausted and at their wits' end, exchanged a look of helplessness. They tried offering another bottle, but the baby refused it, continuing to wail. It was clear that they were running out of options. The boy couldn't take it anymore. He stood up from his seat in coach and, without saying a word to his mother, slowly made his way up the aisle toward the front of the plane. The flight attendants looked at him curiously as he passed them. Some of the passengers turned their heads to watch, wondering what this boy might do. As the boy made his way through the aisles of the plane, his small figure moving past rows of seats, a mixture of curiosity and confusion filled the cabin. People watched him, wondering what he was doing. His mother had noticed him standing, but she was too distracted by the noise to stop him. The boy, though only a child, seemed determined in his movements. He didn't look back at his seat or at his mother. His eyes were fixed on the front of the plane, where the crying baby was still wailing loudly. The closer he got to the front, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere felt. The once peaceful cabin had turned into a space of uneasy tension. The flight attendants, who had been trying their best to assist the parents, looked increasingly helpless as the baby's cries continued to pierce the air. They offered smiles, but even the most skilled of attendants could see there was no quick fix to this situation. The passengers in the nearby rows were growing visibly upset, and a few of them began to exchange whispered complaints with each other. The boy, though aware of the discomfort around him, didn't flinch. He simply walked forward, passing rows of people who were watching him now, whispering among themselves. They were wondering what this young child could possibly do to stop the crying. When the boy finally reached the front of the plane, he stood quietly for a moment, watching the scene unfold before him. The mother was still trying her best to calm the baby, her face flushed with frustration. The father looked weary, rubbing his eyes as he tried holding the child in various ways, but nothing seemed to work. The baby's cries were still loud, and each attempt to soothe her only resulted in more tears. The boy didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there watching. The parents, distracted by their struggle, didn't notice him immediately. The flight attendants, too, were busy with their own tasks, trying to help however they could. After a few moments, the boy cleared his throat softly. The sound was gentle, almost as if he didn't want to disturb the parents even more than they already were. But his presence was now known. The father glanced up, surprised to see a boy standing in front of him. His first instinct was to say something, to ask the boy what he was doing. But there was something about the boy's calm demeanor that made him hesitate. Instead of speaking, the boy just looked at him, and then at the baby in the father's arms. The boy's gaze softened as he observed the child. He could tell the baby wasn't just crying out of hunger or discomfort. This was something deeper, something that had been going on for much longer than either parent had expected. The boy's heart went out to them. Without waiting for a response, the boy spoke in a quiet voice, barely above a whisper. "Would you like me to try something?" The parents were taken aback at first. It wasn't often that strangers spoke to them so directly, especially in such a situation. They exchanged a quick glance, unsure of what to do. But there was something about the boy's voice, calm and gentle, that made them pause. They had tried everything, different bottles, different positions, even pacing up and down the aisle. But nothing had worked. The idea of trying something new, especially from a child, seemed like their last hope. The mother, still holding the baby, gave a tired nod. "If you think it will help." She trailed off, not quite knowing what to expect. She was exhausted and at this point willing to try anything. The boy took a deep breath, then gently stepped closer. His actions were measured, his movements slow and deliberate. The baby's cries seemed to fade slightly as he approached, as if sensing that something different was about to happen. The boy didn't rush. He moved with a kind of quiet confidence, the kind that comes only from a deep understanding of people, and in this case, children. He looked at the baby for a long moment, his small hand reaching up to touch the child's arm. His touch was soft, almost tender, like the hand of someone who had held their own younger siblings or cousins. The boy didn't say anything else. Instead, he just stood there, letting the silence between him and the baby stretch for a few seconds. Then softly the boy began to hum. It wasn't a song that anyone recognized, but it was a soothing, gentle melody. It wasn't loud or forceful, but quiet enough to blend in with the hum of the airplane engines. The sound of the boy's humming seemed to carry a warmth in it, a quiet reassurance that slowly filled the space around him. At first, the parents were unsure of what to make of it. They had never heard a child hum so quietly, especially not in such a delicate situation. But they kept quiet, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it would work. As the boy continued, the baby's cries began to soften. The wails that had once filled the cabin now seemed like distant echoes. The baby, still in her mother's arms, began to stir, her tiny eyes fluttering. The father watched in disbelief, as did the flight attendants and other passengers. The change was subtle at first. The baby's face, which had been scrunched in distress, started to relax. Her breathing slowed, and within moments her cries stopped altogether. The silence that followed was almost more deafening than the crying had been. It felt like the whole plane was holding its breath. The boy continued humming, unperturbed by the stares or the silence around him. His expression was serene, as if he had done this before. He wasn't trying to make a show of it. He was just helping, quietly, without expecting anything in return. The mother, her face a mixture of disbelief and relief, looked down at her baby. The baby, now calm, had her eyes closed, her tiny hands resting peacefully in her mother's arms. The father, who had been on the verge of tears from exhaustion, looked at the boy with a mix of gratitude and awe. He had no words at first, not knowing how to thank someone who had done something so unexpected. The flight attendants, too, were silent. They had seen their fair share of in-flight incidents, but nothing like this. As the boy finished humming, he took a small step back. The baby was now asleep, her breathing even and peaceful. The parents looked at each other in wonder, not quite sure how to process what had just happened. They had been ready to give up, ready to admit that they were out of solutions. But this boy, a complete stranger, had somehow managed to do what they couldn't. He had calmed their baby. The silence on the plane was thick, almost like the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The parents, still holding their baby, looked down at her in disbelief. The baby, who had been crying relentlessly for what felt like hours, was now peacefully asleep in her mother's arms, her little chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. It was as if a miracle had just taken place right before their eyes. The boy, still standing quietly at the front of the plane, watched the parents for a moment. He didn't say anything, and he didn't expect any praise. He had simply done what he thought would help. His soft humming had worked, and now the baby was at peace. There was no need for words or recognition. He had done what needed to be done. The father, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gratitude, finally spoke. His voice was shaky, like he had been holding his emotions in check for far too long. "Thank you," he said, his words filled with sincerity. "I don't know how to thank you enough. We've tried everything and nothing worked." He paused, looking down at his wife and then back at the boy. "You've done something that no one else could." The mother, too, looked up at the boy, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "You've helped us more than you know," she said softly, her voice still full of wonder. "Thank you." The boy didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his face calm and serene. He wasn't interested in praise. He wasn't even looking for a reward. To him, it was just a simple act of kindness, helping someone in need without any expectation of something in return. He had seen his mother do similar things for others, and it had always felt like the right thing to do. As the parents continued to look at him, their eyes filled with gratitude, the boy slowly stepped back. He didn't want to make a big deal out of the moment. He turned, ready to return to his seat in coach, but before he could take a step, the flight attendants, who had been watching the whole exchange, approached him. "Excuse me, young man, one of the attendants said, her voice warm but still filled with surprise. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did. That was incredible." She smiled at him, clearly impressed by his calm and kindness. Not many people would have stepped up like that. The boy simply smiled back. "It was nothing," he said quietly. "I just wanted to help." The flight attendants exchanged looks, clearly moved by his humility. One of them patted him gently on the shoulder. "You've certainly made this flight a lot easier for everyone. You're a very special kid." The boy shrugged, a modest gesture that suggested he didn't think he had done anything extraordinary. To him, helping someone in need was just the right thing to do. He had been raised to understand that kindness didn't need recognition. It was something you did because it was right, not because you expected praise. As the boy made his way back to his seat, the atmosphere in the plane began to shift. The tension that had filled the cabin just moments before seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of calm. Passengers who had been fidgeting and glancing at the clock, waiting for the flight to be over, now settled back into their seats. The baby's peaceful slumber had brought a quiet peace to the entire plane. The boy sat back down next to his mother, who had been watching him from across the aisle. She gave him a small, knowing smile, one that only a mother could give. She hadn't asked him what had happened or how he had calmed the baby, but she knew he had done something special. She could see the quiet confidence in his eyes, the same confidence that had led him to stand up and do what he thought was right. The boy didn't talk much as the plane continued its journey. He was content in the quiet of the moment, content knowing that he had helped. His mother returned to her book, but every now and then she would glance at him, a look of pride in her eyes. She had always taught him the importance of kindness, of helping others when they needed it most. And now, watching him, she felt like he had taken that lesson to heart in a way that few adults would ever do. At the front of the plane, the parents were still gazing down at their baby, who remained fast asleep, her tiny hands resting gently on her mother's chest. The father, who had been on the verge of a breakdown earlier, now looked like a man who had been given a second chance. He exhaled a deep breath as if he had been holding it in for hours. The mother, too, looked more relaxed, her face softening as she watched their daughter sleep peacefully. For the rest of the flight, the parents remained quiet. They didn't talk much to each other, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had been through something difficult, something that had tested their patience and their strength. But now, thanks to a stranger, a young boy, they had found peace. They would never forget this moment, the kindness that had been shown to them when they felt the most helpless. As the plane began its descent toward their destination, the flight attendants walked up and down the aisles, preparing for landing. The boy's mother looked at him one more time, a proud smile on her face. "You did something really special today," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope you know that." The boy nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to be told. He knew. The remainder of the flight passed quietly. The once disturbing cries of the baby now replaced by the soft hum of the plane's engines. The boy sat back in his seat, his eyes half closed as he relaxed into the comfort of the moment. The tension that had gripped the cabin earlier was gone, and in its place was a peaceful atmosphere. Even the other passengers, who had been so visibly irritated just an hour before, now seemed to find their own peace. The boy's mother, still sitting beside him, couldn't help but glance at him occasionally. There was something about the way he had handled the situation, his calmness, his quiet confidence, that filled her with pride. She had always taught him that it was important to help others, to show kindness whenever possible. And today, in the most unexpected of ways, he had done just that. But it wasn't just the fact that he had helped. It was the way he had done it, with no fanfare, no expectation of anything in return. He had simply done what felt right. As the minutes ticked by, the boy leaned back in his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't the kind of child who liked to draw attention to himself, but he also wasn't one to shy away from what he believed was the right thing to do. In a world where people often seemed too busy or too distracted to notice the needs of others, he had taken the time to offer a quiet solution to a problem that had left the baby's parents feeling helpless. In the front of the plane, the parents of the baby were still sitting quietly, their gaze fixed on their sleeping daughter. The relief on their faces was unmistakable. They exchanged a look, one that said everything they were feeling: gratitude, amazement, and a deep sense of calm. The baby's cries had been overwhelming, but now, for the first time in what felt like hours, they could finally relax. They had been ready to give up, ready to admit that they couldn't calm their child. But a stranger, someone they would never see again, had done something they couldn't. The father shifted in his seat, looking down at his wife. "I don't know what we would have done without him," he said quietly. His voice was filled with wonder, as if he couldn't quite grasp how such a young boy could have such a calming effect. That was incredible. The mother nodded, her eyes still on their baby. "I've never seen anything like it," she replied softly. She had seen her share of difficult moments with their daughter, but nothing had quite compared to the desperation they had felt on this flight. But now everything was different. The baby was asleep, peaceful in her arms, and for the first time in hours the couple could finally breathe. Back in the cabin, the boy's mother too had noticed the change in the atmosphere. The once tense, restless air had shifted. People were quieter now, more relaxed. Some passengers who had been irritated by the crying had even returned to their books or settled into their seats as if nothing had happened. The boy's simple act of kindness had transformed the mood of the entire plane, and it wasn't lost on anyone. As the flight continued, the boy's mother leaned closer to him. "I'm really proud of you, you know," she said quietly, her voice filled with warmth. She wasn't one to give out compliments lightly, but this time she couldn't help herself. She had always known that her son was special, that he had a good heart, but seeing him in action, seeing him help someone without hesitation, made her heart swell with pride. "You did something really amazing today." The boy smiled modestly, his gaze still fixed ahead of him. "I just wanted to help," he said simply. There was no need for praise in his mind. The act of kindness had been its own reward. It was what he had been taught to do, help others when they needed it without expecting anything in return. The flight attendants, too, had begun to notice the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. They moved through the aisles with a newfound sense of ease, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers as they went. No one seemed to mind the occasional bump of the cart or the small disturbances of daily flight routines. The quiet peace that had settled over the plane made it feel like everyone had been given a second chance to relax. As the plane neared its destination, the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing the upcoming descent. The passengers, many of whom had been restless just hours earlier, now looked out the windows with a sense of calm. The boy's actions had brought a sense of unity to the flight, something that was rare on a crowded commercial airline. In the seats behind the boy, a middle-aged couple who had been sitting near the crying baby exchanged a few words. "That boy," the man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like it. He just went up there and calmed that baby down. How did he do it?" His wife, equally amazed, nodded in agreement. "It was like magic. I can't even explain it." She paused, glancing at the front of the plane where the parents were still holding their child. "It's funny," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "You never really know how much you need help until someone steps in and gives it to you." The man nodded. Yeah, he didn't expect anything. He just did it because he could. There was a pause before he added, "That's the kind of person we all should be." Meanwhile, the boy's mother couldn't help but overhear their conversation. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but their words made her smile. It was nice to hear that others had recognized what her son had done. In a world where kindness was often overlooked or taken for granted, it was refreshing to know that people still noticed. As the plane began its final descent, the boy's mother felt a sense of peace settle over her as well. She looked at her son, her heart swelling with pride. He had done something incredible today, something that would stay with her and with everyone on that plane for a long time. But more than that, he had reminded her of the power of small acts of kindness, the kind that often go unnoticed but have the ability to change everything. The boy, meanwhile, was content. He had done what he thought was right, and that was enough. There was no need for a grand gesture, no need for recognition. All that mattered was that he had helped, and that was all he needed. As the plane began to descend, the sound of the engines shifted from the steady hum to a soft whirring, a signal that they were getting closer to their destination. The once crowded cabin now felt like a place of quiet reflection. The passengers who had been so frustrated earlier were now relaxed, many of them lost in their thoughts while others gazed out the windows, watching the ground grow closer. The boy, still sitting with his mother, looked out the window too. His eyes followed the landscape below, which was gradually becoming more distinct as the plane lowered its altitude. There was no excitement or anticipation in his gaze. He was simply taking it all in. It was hard to tell if he was aware of the impact of his actions earlier, but the calmness that surrounded him suggested that he was at peace with himself. The boy's mother, who had been observing him for much of the flight, finally spoke again. "You know, what you did today was very special," she said softly, her voice full of admiration. The boy turned to look at her, his expression unchanged. He didn't need to be told what he did was special, but hearing it from his mother made it feel real. "I just helped," he replied, his voice as calm as ever. His mother smiled. "Yes, but not everyone would have done that. You saw someone in need and you stepped up. That's something not a lot of people would do." The boy shifted in his seat slightly, looking out the window again. "I didn't think about it that much. I just thought she needed help." His mother nodded, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. "That's what makes it so special. You didn't do it for any reward or because you expected anything. You just did it because you could." For a few moments they both fell silent as the plane continued its descent. The boy's mother felt a swell of pride in her chest. She had always known her son was different, not in an extraordinary way, but in a way that made him stand out for his kindness and empathy. He was the kind of child who noticed when others were struggling and stepped in, quietly and without hesitation. She could see that he had a deep understanding of the world, even at his young age, and that was a gift she hoped would continue to grow in him. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign flickered off, the passengers began to stir, collecting their belongings and preparing to leave. The boy's mother stood and began to gather their things, glancing once more at her son. He was already looking around the cabin, noticing how things had changed. Where there had once been frustration and discomfort, there was now a sense of calm. The boy's actions had done more than just soothe a crying baby. It had soothed the entire atmosphere of the plane. The parents of the baby, who had remained quiet throughout the rest of the flight, stood up as well, carefully picking up their child. They looked at each other, exchanging a look that said everything they were feeling: relief, gratitude, and perhaps even a sense of awe at what had just happened. As they made their way down the aisle, they passed the boy and his mother. The mother, holding her baby, stopped for a moment and looked at the boy. Her eyes were filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you again," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "What you did for our baby, I don't think we could ever thank you enough." The boy, who had been looking down at his feet, lifted his head and smiled modestly. "It was nothing," he said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to help someone in need. The parents exchanged another look, their eyes filled with appreciation. "Still," the father said, "you've done something that means more than words can express. You've helped us more than you know." The boy nodded again, his modesty preventing him from saying anything further. He wasn't looking for recognition. He didn't need it. The simple act of helping had been enough for him, and that was all that mattered. As the parents walked past, the flight attendants, who had been standing near the front of the cabin, gave the boy an approving nod. They had watched the entire exchange, and it was clear that they, too, had been moved by his actions. One of them, a woman who had been serving drinks earlier, stopped by the boy's seat. "You know," she said with a smile, "you've made this flight a lot more peaceful. I think everyone here will remember you." The boy smiled politely but didn't respond. He wasn't seeking any kind of recognition. He had already done what he set out to do. But the warmth in the flight attendant's words made him feel good. It was nice to know that what he did had made a difference, even if it was in a small way. As the plane emptied out and passengers slowly made their way off, the boy's mother gave him one last proud look. "You made a real difference today," she said quietly. "I hope you remember that." The boy nodded, his face calm, his thoughts far from the praise he had just received. To him, it wasn't about recognition. It was about doing what felt right in the moment. Helping someone in need was simply the thing to do, and that was all that mattered. They left the plane together, the boy's mother walking beside him with a hand on his shoulder. The airport was bustling with people, families, business travelers, tourists. But for the boy and his mother, everything felt a little quieter. The noise of the world seemed distant compared to the quiet moment they had shared on the plane, the moment that had shown them both the power of kindness. As they stepped out into the terminal, the boy glanced up at his mother. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" he asked, referring to the parents of the baby. His mother smiled down at him. Maybe not, she said, but I think they'll remember you. The boy thought about that for a moment, then nodded. He didn't need to see them again to know that he had done something good. The memory of the baby's peaceful face, resting in her mother's arms, was enough, and in that moment, the boy knew something that most people never learn. Kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change the world, one moment at a time.